We're going to hit on two big themes. Obviously, trust, but then also how trust impacts the data economy, and we have people who are experts in that. I want to just quickly introduce you to everybody. All the way down to the right, we have Sandy Pentland, who's a professor of Stanford, and he has really, really good expertise in sort of the technical side of the fair data economy. To his left, we have Margot Edelman, who is the general manager of Edelman. Margot has a deep expertise in technology. She built Edelman's office in San Francisco a few years ago. And then to my right, we have Joël Mesot, who's the president of ETH Zurich. For any of my Americans who are in the crowd, it's sort of like the MIT of Switzerland. So let's get started. Every year for the past 25 years, Edelman has put out a massive study on trust. And this year is one of the most groundbreaking years for the study, because I think, and Margot, I want to have you talk about what the study shows. It really shows a deeper erosion of trust all over the world than we've ever seen, and not just in government, but across multiple institutions like business and NGOs and the media. Tell me about your key takeaways, Margot.
Sure, thank you. And just for those of you who don't know, Edelman has studied trust for 25 years. We look at it in business, government, media, and NGOs, and the key thing is we do it as a global study. It's done in 28 countries around the world, and specifically this year what we found is that there's a group of people that have extremely high grievance. So they're people that feel the system hasn't worked for them, and increasingly they feel disenfranchised, they feel like they don't have the right information, they feel like they can't trust any institution. Frankly, things like how COVID was handled only exacerbated their feelings of grievance to the point where we are today. And so those folks are really the ones who are driving sort of that level of distrust across institutions. And what we found is that really because of these folks who really have this very high level of grievance, it is causing sort of business to potentially lose its license to lead. So what we're saying today is that business needs to act, but it needs to act together, and it shouldn't necessarily lead because of this sort of folks with very high levels of grievance. And then sort of going back to how it relates to the larger topic, having really sort of this base level of trust we think is sort of key for things like the fair data economy. I mean, that's what's going to essentially allow the fair data economy to thrive, to flourish. So if we don't have that base level of trust, we're all in trouble.
And one of the craziest takeaways from that study, by the way, is that there's a record number of people who condone using violence because of their grievance to make change, which speaks to a lot of the big disruption that I think we're seeing in the States and elsewhere. Sandy, when we talk about the fair data economy, one of the big trade-offs that I think users felt like they had to make was in order to access free services, they had to give up their data. And I think for a long time they weren't educated about the extent of which they had to give up, and so they conceded it. Something has shifted in the past few years. I think Project Liberty hits a chord on that, where people really care now about their data. Walk me through the ones that you see in this transformation, and what should we do about it to make sure that people can kind of bring back control while still getting access to free services?
Well, I think that the sort of top level thing, people have realized that the traditional way of thinking about power has to do with labor and capital, but now there's a third one, data. And actually even Xi Jinping, had the largest voice for Marxism, which is those two, right, says data is now the third part of that. People are realizing they have no power over this primary means of production. That means that they are cattle in the slaughterhouse of whatever. And I think that's a lot of it. They feel really exploited. And so early roots of that is why I'm here, actually. I was co-led the discussion that led to GDPR, helped form a number of things in countries around the world. But those regulations don't really bite, right? They're not operationalized. You may have the right to it, but you can't do it. So what you see in countries around the world, people beginning to band together to control their data rights. So like at the recent G20, our proposal about cooperatives to manage data for you was one of the most discussed things.
Wow.
Okay. Of course, that was in India, and India is nothing if not, co-op central, right? But now, with all this sort of agentic AI around, we realize there's another way, and that's working with Consumer Reports, which is actually Consumer Union that publishes consumer reports, to help people have an agent for them. So, the world is going to be full of agents. They're all going to be trying to sell you stuff or tell you what to do, and the trust is going to go down even more. You got to have something to protect yourself, right?
Yes.
So what we're doing with Stanford and Mozilla and other sorts of foundations is building a consumer agent to protect you, to help you and defend you against these sort of exploitive things. And the way that works is through this cooperative thing where advertisers, other sort of people, don't know particularly who you are, but they know what group you decided to join. And so if there's going to be advertising, it's what your group decided it wanted to see. And what that forces is for product makers, service officers, to do things that groups will decide that they want to see that. So no more schlock and exploitive stuff, because people will opt out, and they can. Right? So that's a really interesting way to approach this, by putting the power of AI in the hands of the individuals.
Yes. Joel, one of the things that Project Liberty is doing is it's saying, people, maybe this sort of co-op idea could be a great one and could work, but they also believe that people should have the ability to have full agency themselves when they're on a platform, because the platform is designed to give people full protection of their data. The challenge is that is technologically, and you can ask any of the Project Liberty folks in the room, one of the most difficult things to build. They're actually building a whole new protocol to try to do it. And it's also hard to get mass adoption, especially when you think about platforms like TikTok that have spent billions just to get user adoption. So my question to you is, technologically, we know that this is possible, but from an infrastructure and economy perspective, it's really hard. Like, what do you think is the right solution?
Oh, this is a tough question. So maybe I'm the least competent on this panel.
Oh, stop.
To
Come
talk.
on.
No, I'm not kidding. On technology. I like the discussion you had, and I have a few questions to the panelists,
Yeah, of course.
if I may.
Yes.
Because the trust issue has been keeping us busy since I'm president of the ETH Zurich, the MIT of Europe, as you said. What I'm observing, and you didn't mention that, there is a decreasing trust in science.
That's right. Yeah.
And when that starts, it becomes very difficult to argue, because you can't argue on data-based facts. And so even in Switzerland, where we are very decentralized, the trust is still quite high, but we can kind of see this decrease. And the COVID, it was mentioned at the beginning, played a huge role. Why? Because certainly, at some point, the Swiss state took the power. And then the people had the impression they have no say anymore. Because in Switzerland, we vote on everything, right? Even the horn of the cows, and so everything. Suddenly, there was no way, because it was a state of urgency. Then came the energy crisis in Europe. You didn't suffer that much in US, but we were hit. Again, the states were taking the power. And so there is this fear that it's going to be only like this in future. And for some reason, they believe the scientists, the university, the elite universities, Stanford, ETH, are part of this. And so have you look at the surveys also? What is the trust to the scientist?
That's a great question. I think ultimately scientists actually are trusted as a spokesperson. They're definitely up there, same as sort of a technical expert within a company. So those are both sort of trusted sources of information. The folks who are not trusted actually are journalists, unfortunately. So, and what's really
and politics was also.
And what's really, and also that an area that's really not trusted is social media. It's the least trusted sector by far. Trust in technology up here, trust in social media is here.
Well, maybe, part
so,
of
So I will answer your
yes.
question. I just want to come here and say this is not something that's only about politics, only about economies and so on. It's touching the roots of what we are based upon, which is fact-based scientific societies. And we had, when we come to the WEF, for us from Switzerland, it's very interesting because you have 20 rectors of the top universities of the world coming here. And of course, we have sessions. And this point was one of the most debated, why we are losing the population. And I believe we also made some mistakes as researchers. Suddenly, during COVID, you could see everyone having an opinion on everything. Of, a mechanical engineer at ETH explaining to the medical staff why the strategy with the mask was completely wrong. That creates such, a confusion in the debate. So, back to your question, we need to restore some discipline in our universities. Experts can talk, explain not only solutions, but the drawback of these solutions, the plus, minus, and it's a huge work. You said TikTok took so much energy and money to get where they are. Are we able to do that as a public institutions?
So let me actually give an example of a person who unfortunately just left. It's Audrey Tang, and she is IT Minister of Taiwan. About a little less than 10 years ago, they had a trust rating of about 7%, among the lowest in the world, and they established digital means of people commenting on everything, including during COVID. And currently, their trust ratings are up around 70%. Okay, so it's possible to turn around, but you have to structure the communication, the agency of people correctly. For instance, with universities, yes, suddenly there was people in science always debate. There's never a right answer. There's progress towards it, but unfortunately, all of the journalists, all the press got in there and saw us fighting with each other for the first time, and so they say, well, they don't know. They're correct, but truth comes from that fight.
Yes.
And that never came across.
Well, it's interesting in the States, we have so much access to free speech. Every platform you can comment. People have more of a voice than ever before, but the trust is worse than ever before because I think, to your point, the structure of how we empower people to speak is very off.
That's right.
And so my question for you is, how would you propose a better structure in a place like the US in which free speech is held at high regard, but trust is low because the structure is bad?
So we did a big experiment, one of the largest social media experiments in the world at Stanford recently, where we looked at distrust and we looked at polarization. And a very simple thing, which is something they do in Taiwan, right, is whenever you comment about something, you have to also look at the spectrum of opinion that people have. So you see all the battles, all the opinions, and how many people think this and how many people think that. It's just a simple little picture, right? But what that does is that tells you that extreme voices that think, oh, all these people are saying this, that voice is wrong because here's the histogram of opinions. Here's the plot of opinions. Actually, like for instance, and as an example, gun control, abortion in the United States, highly polarized. But actually, it's not. There's huge consensus about it, probably more than most things, very moderate policies, but then there are extremely loud voices on the edge. And when you can see the diagram of all the things, all this, summary statistics, you realize that's an extreme voice. Most people are like me. And what we found is that changed people's voting. A 5-minute exposure to those sorts of things changed the way people vote rather dramatically.
Wow. Joel?
2 points from outside. Thank you for saying this, because I'm trying to convince the newspapers, the journalists, when they enter into a debate. I explain how it happens, and it came a bit from the US. So they take, let's say, climate change, okay? They take one voice who is convinced that climate change is happening, representing 99% of the scientists, and one voice against, just to have a debate.
Right.
But it gives the impression it's 50-50 when you don't think about it. So I proposed a new newspaper in Switzerland, put how many people are represented by this person and by this person. Of course, they laughed at me. Okay, it's impossible to do, but we should maybe work more in that direction. The second point I wanted to mention, we have a guy called Dominic Hangartner, maybe you know, at ETH, working on hate speeches. and his research is now in Switzerland, spread in Switzerland. And how can we stop hate speech when you have extreme people having these hate speeches? And what he found out is the way we reply can kind of stop it very quickly, or even amplify it. And our first reaction is to react in an emotional way, and so it will just get worse. So now we are trying to educate also population how to react on that.
Yeah, I'll give you just one factoid. So NPR, National Public Radio in the United States, did a survey worldwide of climate change. 85% of all the people in the world think governments are not doing enough for climate change. On the other hand, 25% of people think that the sun goes around the earth. So climate denial is actually not the problem. It's trying to address it. If you have 85% who believe this, right, let's get moving.
Yeah.
Let's actually have concrete proposals and begin working on it.
Just
right?
something I wanted to note in response to you, Joel. At our company, we made a Bill of Rights, and one of the things we said to address that issue was that there are certain things we believe to be true, and we will not give weighted sides because we know a certain argument to be true, one of which is climate change. So we don't need to elevate the side of a climate denier because we believe it to be true as a company. And I think that's a helpful solution if a company is willing to take a perspective like that. And we're not a political company. We're just a data and fact-based company. Margot, when it comes to the trust studies that Edelman has done, the denigration of trust in social media, I think, is very important because it also aligns with what you found, that most people in America especially are getting their news from social media. So how do we bridge that problem of people say they don't trust this, but this is what people are relying on to get their news and information?
That's a great question, and I think especially with sort of the changes at Meta in particular, going from fact-checking to community notes, really means that even more action is needed to prevent misinformation. So our recommendation as a business is that companies actually need to be even more active on social to really ensure that the right information about their company is out there, and they don't let misinformation sort of continue or linger, because there's so much out there. Anybody can kind of comment, give an opinion. So it's important for companies to really sort of very quickly understand what's being said about them, and then really take an active stance to put out their own information, really continue to act as their own media company, but in some ways, frankly, their own social media company, to get the right information out about them. And then just going back to your point, I mean, a key factor from this year's Trust Barometer that we found is, and in particular going to climate change, is that people believe that business has the license to act, and that CEOs in particular have the license to act in areas where their business can make a difference, and also in areas that impact their business. So if it impacts their employees, if it impacts their customers, if it's an area related to their business, then they're able to act. So if it's something specifically related to climate change within their supply chain, for example, they're able to act on that. And it's, for us, what we say now is it's about acting first and then communicating versus communicating and then acting. So that's a key component as well. It's all about the action.
Yeah.
Joel, and one of the things Margot said was, Meta pulling back fact-checking and introducing community notes. On one hand, there's a lot of concern that that's not going to work. On the other, I think about what Sandy said about giving people the power in Taiwan to comment. It actually makes them more trusting of the system. Like, what's your take on that?
We need to enter into a dialogue with every part of the population, even those who refused. 30% in Switzerland completely refused the vaccine, and even put, votes on this all the time. It's not accepted, but it shows it's a growing part. And some people say just ignore them. No, go into a dialogue and explain how it's working, and with time we can maybe change a little bit these dynamics. But for me, there is another point that's worrying me a lot, and I know a few people here share this worry. So there was a study about the Earth being not round but a plate,
flat,
right?
Yeah.
And in France, and then the first number was a bit shocking. 13% think the Earth is flat. I mean, when you know it's flat, so it's only 13%, right? No, I'm joking. I hope it's not recorded. So,
Chatham House rule.
no, but the number that worried me more is that when you go to people over 60, it goes down to 6%.
Wow.
So you see where I'm coming. Younger population, I think the number was below 25, 18%. So there is a shift in the population. And now the second shock was a few weeks ago at ETH. I mean, kind of mathematics driven, kind of a bit square people like me. And so students coming to me and say, look, research is very easy. I say, what do you mean? You just put the question on ChatGPT, you get the answer. And so I start to, what are we doing with this technology? So we need to act fast and even more intensively, because the next generation is going to have this mindset, right? And so, yeah, we have a lot of work to do. That's why at ETH we launched now this program that is called Dialogue with Society, but it means with politics, with administrations where the laws are made, and with the society at large, kids, students, and so on.
We have just a minute left. I'm going to end with you, Sandy. Joel brought up AI, ChatGPT, and I think this is going to introduce a whole new era of consideration of user data. Like, how are you approaching this?
Well, we're trying to build agents for people to defend them. But the other thing is that there's a principle of not removing human agency. Humans have to be in charge of this. So for instance, actually things like ChatGPT are very interesting and useful in science to see what other people are saying. So most people say, here's a hypothesis, here's what we're going to do. Let's check what everybody else is doing. And that's a pretty reasonable thing to do. People find that useful. But that doesn't remove the agency of the person. And so what we need to do is we need to construct agents and AI and so forth that's respectful of humans and human agency in doing this. And I think that it's not an impossible thing to do. It is something that when I do a lot of talking to boards of directors, what I try to emphasize is if you remove human agency, what you are is you're incurring liability. Now your company is doing something that's very risky because the AI is going to make mistakes and you're on the hook. You really need to have some human judgment in there if you're going to be safe as a company. And that gets through to boards of directors because that's their primary charge, right, is to keep the thing safe, right?
You're seeing this with Character.ai getting sued, and that's a major lawsuit that could impact the company. Just a few things to wrap up that we learned today. I think giving users power over their data and giving them power over conversation and speech is a clear through line here. It really struck a chord with me, Joel, how you were saying some of the COVID era angst around people not feeling like they had a voice was very, very prominent. I was actually in Bern during the protests at that time, and I was amazed by it. Margot's 25-year Edelman Trust Barometer shows this year that the trust in institutions has gone way down, in part because people don't feel like they have a voice. It's causing high levels of grievance that we've never seen before. You talked, Sandy, about how we don't see the full spectrum of opinion. And we only see some of the most polarized voices, which is what in turn makes us more polarized. It speaks to what Margot was saying, that the people with the most grievances are the ones that are the loudest in creating the sort of the most visibility around issues. Sandy brought up the example of Taiwan, 7% trust. Then they introduce commenting, builds up to 70% trust, sort of provides a blueprint for what we could be doing here in the United States. When we talked about the sort of tension between free speech, but also making sure people feel empowered, Joel brought up something interesting, which he says academic institutions in particular need to have discipline. If we're going to use our voice, we have to use it in a really, sort of sound academic way. And then, I think the big thing here is figuring out how people can have human agency is very, very critical. Sandy said at the end, if you remove human agency, you incur a ton of corporate liability. Goes to what Margot was saying, how companies are now being expected to act. Well, if they're being expected to act, they also have to address that liability. I want to thank everybody here, especially Project Liberty, because this is something that Frank McCourt did not have to do and chose to do because he cares about this issue. And so he's one of the voices that is really propelling this conversation forward. Thank you all for joining us today, and a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you, Joe.